There is a crack in the limestone, not wide, barely enough for a fingertip, but it runs deep, deep enough to swallow 10,000 seasons of silence. If you pressed your hand against it now, you would feel something cold rise through the stone, something older than the name we gave it, older than the kingdom that claimed it, older than the language carved into the slab between its pores. The Great Sphinx does not speak. It does not need to. Its shadow stretches east at dawn like a memory reaching for something it has already forgotten. Dust has buried this shape before, many times. Sand climbed its chest, swallowed its shoulders, sealed its gaze beneath a pale and patient tide. And each time hands came, ancient hands, desperate hands, reverent hands, to clear the weight away. They found what they expected stone. But beneath the stone, beneath the repairs and the prayers and the royal decrees, something else waited. Something no inscription ever named. There is a rhythm older than history that draws certain minds towards certain questions. The way water finds the lowest crack, the way ash settles into the shape of what once burned. You followed that rhythm here. You may not know why yet, but the stone knows. What if the Sphinx was never built by the civilization we credit? What if it was already ancient when the first pharaoh laid the first brick a relic inherited? Not created a monument from a chapter of human memory we have not yet learned to read, the evidence does not shout. It accumulates quietly, piece by piece, across disciplines that do not always agree on how time should be measured. Stay with me. Let's drift a little deeper. The Giza plateau at night is not the place you have seen in photographs. Strip away the tour buses and the floodlights, remove the voices and the camera shutters, and what remains is something far older than tourism, far quieter than spectacle. There is a quality to the air after sundown that the desert guards jealously, a stillness so complete that you can hear your own blood moving through your temples, a silence so layered that it seems to have weight, as though the atmosphere itself has been compressed by the accumulated pressure of millennia pressing down from above. The sand, which blazed white and gold under the afternoon sun, now turns the colour of cold bone beneath a sky so dense with stars that it appears less like emptiness, and more like a membrane stretched thin over something luminous and unnameable. The temperature drops with a swiftness that surprises the skin. Stone that burned to the touch at midday now radiates its stored warmth back into the void, slowly, reluctantly, the way a dying fire surrenders its last breath. Not all at once, but in long diminishing exhalations that you feel against your ankles and your wrists before you consciously register the chill. This is where it begins. Not in a textbook, not in a museum, not in the bright certainty of a lecture hall, but here, on the edge of a limestone ridge that was already ancient, when the first pharaoh drew his first breath in the company of dust so fine that it moves like smoke in the shadow of a shape that has no name old enough to be its true one. The Great Sphinx crouches in its enclosure, the way a sleeping animal settles into earth not on the surface, but into it as though the rock opened and the figure emerged from within rather than being imposed from above. At night, with the tourists gone and the generators quiet, the monument does not look carved. It looks grown. It looks like something the plateau dreamed during one of its longer, deeper exhalations and then forgot to reabsorb. The enclosure walls rise on either side like the banks of a dry river, and if you press your palm flat against the western face, you will feel the stone still warm from the day's sun, a warmth that fades as your hand remains replaced by something cooler, something that seems to rise from inside the rock itself, from beds laid down 40 million years ago when this ridge was the floor of a shallow tropical sea. That sea is important. Not because it explains the Sphinx, nothing explains the Sphinx, not fully, not yet, but because it establishes the first and most fundamental layer of time that this place holds. The limestone beneath your feet is made of compressed shells, coral fragments, the calcified remains of organisms so small that millions of them fit inside a single block. They lived, they died, they drifted to the bottom, and they were slowly, impossibly slowly transformed into stone by pressure and mineral-rich water seeping through the sediment over epochs that make human history look like a single heartbeat. Erosion is time thinking. It is the planet running its fingers across its own surface, testing what holds and what gives way, and here on this plateau, The thinking has been going on for so long that the stone carries the memory of conditions that no living human has ever witnessed. Wetter centuries when rain fell seasonally across what is now bare desert. Cooler centuries when dew gathered on exposed rock faces every night and slowly dissolved the calcium carbonate grain by grain. Warmer centuries when salt crystals bloomed inside microscopic pores and pried the stone apart from within like seeds germinating in the dark. You can feel those centuries if you know where to place your attention. Run your fingers along the enclosure wall and you will find alternating textures: smooth, where harder beds of limestone resisted the millennia recessed, where softer beds surrendered, ridged where joints and fractures channeled water during storms that may have fallen 3,000 years ago, or 7,000 years ago, or longer. The stone does not date itself. It simply records. It records the way a journal records without knowing it will be read faithfully and differently, without emphasis or omission. And the record it holds is so layered, so dense with overlapping processes, that reading it requires not just knowledge but patience. The kind of patience that the desert itself practices, the patience of sand that buries a monument to its neck and then waits 1,000 years for someone to come and dig it free. The Sphinx has been buried this way many times. It has been swallowed by the plateau's own exhalation of dust and then uncovered by hands that believed they were rescuing something sacred. Each burial slowed certain kinds of decay while accelerating others. Each clearance exposed fresh surfaces to wind and light and the slow chemistry of arid air meeting marine limestone. The monument you see today is not the monument that was carved. It is the monument that survived the carving and the burying and the clearing and the repairing and the burying again, a palimpsest written in stone rather than ink, each layer partially obscuring the one beneath. Tonight the air is dry. The relative humidity hovers somewhere around 15%, low enough that your lips crack if you speak too long, low enough that the moisture in your breath vanishes before it travels a foot from your mouth. This dryness is deceptive. It suggests permanent stability, a world frozen in amber. But the plateau has not always been this dry. Paleoclimate records drawn from lake sediments, pollen, cores, and fossil assemblages tell a different story. A story of fluctuation of centuries when grasslands crept northward across the Sahara, and seasonal rains darkened the rock, and filled shallow wadis with muddy temporary rivers that carved channels into the very stone you are touching now. Those channels are still here. They are part of the record, they are part of the argument, and they are part of the reason that the age of the Sphinx remains not a settled fact, but an open corridor through which different disciplines walk at different speeds, seeing different things, reaching different walls. Gravity is memory. It pulls everything downward, sand into the enclosure water along the natural slope from west to east, sediment into cracks, meaning into silence. The Sphinx sits at the bottom of this accumulated pull, not just physically, but temporally, a low point where time collects. The way rainwater collects in a desert basin after a rare storm, pooling briefly, leaving a residue, then vanishing into the porous rock below. The night deepens. The stars rotate imperceptibly. Somewhere to the east beyond the Makatam Hills, the Nile continues its own ancient rhythm, carrying silt from the Ethiopian highlands toward the Mediterranean, a rhythm that predates every monument on this plateau and will outlast them all. The Sphinx does not watch the river. Its gaze is fixed on the horizon, on the point where the sun will rise in a few hours, the same point it has watched for as long as it has had eyes. However long that is, however deep that question reaches, however many layers of stone and silence and buried time must be peeled back before something resembling an answer begins to emerge from the dark. Let your breathing slow. Let the plateau hold you. The stone is patient, and so is the night, and so is the question that brought you here. The question that has no single answer, only a deepening, only a settling only, the slow accumulation of evidence and wonder and doubt layered one upon the other like the beds of ancient limestone beneath your feet, each one recording a world that no longer exists, each one whispering that the past is not behind us but below us, not gone but compressed, not forgotten but waiting. Evidence does not arrive the way stories do. Stories have beginnings, midpoints, revelations, They move forward with the confidence of something that knows where it is going. Evidence is different. Evidence accumulates the way sediment accumulates on the floor of a shallow sea grain, by grain layer by layer, without announcement, without direction, without the courtesy of arranging itself into a narrative that the human mind can hold comfortably in a single thought. The evidence surrounding the Great Sphinx has been gathering for more than a century of formal investigation, and for millennia before that, in the form of marks left on stone fragments of text carved into granite offerings, placed between massive paws by hands that believed they were honouring something older than memory itself. None of this evidence shouts. It whispers. And the whispers do not always agree. Begin with the stone, because the stone is where everything begins and where everything returns. The limestone body of the Sphinx belongs to the Mokatam Formation, a sequence of marine beds deposited during the Eocene epoch, roughly 40 to 50 million years ago, when the Giza plateau was submerged beneath a warm, shallow ocean, teeming with nummulites and foraminifera, tiny shelled organisms whose compressed remains now constitute the very rock from which the monument was carved. Geologists mapping the site have identified distinct layers within this formation, each with its own density, porosity, and resistance to decay, and these layers run horizontally through the Sphinx's body, like the pages of a book laid on its side. Some pages thick and stubborn, others thin and soft and eager to crumble at the first touch of moisture or wind. This is the first piece of evidence, and it is not dramatic. It is quiet. It tells us that the monument was not carved from a uniform block, but from a complex internally variable ridge of ancient seabed, and that any attempt to read its surface as a simple clock, deeper erosion equals older age, must account for the fact that some parts of that surface were born weaker than others and would have surrendered faster regardless of when the chisel first touched them. The enclosure walls offer the next layer of testimony. When the Sphinx was carved, enormous volumes of bedrock were removed from around it, leaving the statue isolated within a trench cut directly into the plateau. The walls of this trench expose the same limestone beds, visible in the body, and their surfaces carry marks that researchers have debated for decades. Rounded profiles where edges should be sharp, vertical grooves that run from top to bottom, like the paths of ancient rivers, smooth hollows that bulge inward, as though the rock had been softened and then reshaped by something patient and persistent. Some geologists see in these features the signature of water, not the catastrophic water of floods, but the slow, repeated water of seasonal rainfall acting over prolonged periods, dissolving calcium carbonate molecule by molecule, widening pores, deepening fractures, smoothing every surface. It touched with the gentleness of something that has no deadline and no intention, only chemistry and time. Others see the same features and read wind, sand-laden wind, striking the enclosure walls at consistent heights, over centuries, preferentially abrading softer beds, undercutting harder ones, producing scallops and hollows that mimic water erosion, closely enough to confuse the eye, but not, they argue, the trained geological mind. The stone holds both readings without choosing between them. Evidence is like that. It permits. It does not decide. Then there is the written record, and it is thinner than you might expect for a monument of this magnitude. The earliest surviving text directly associated with the Sphinx is the dream, stela, a granite slab erected between the forepaws during the reign of Thutmose IV, a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty who ruled around 1400 BCE. The inscription tells a story of a prince who fell asleep in the shadow of the great head. The body was already buried beneath sand and received a divine promise: clear the sand and the throne will be yours. The text is damaged. Key sections are illegible. But what survives is revealing, not for what it says, but for what it assumes. It does not name a builder. It does not describe an origin. It treats the Sphinx as something that was already there, already, ancient, already, sacred, already half swallowed by the desert and in need of rescue. The stela is not a birth certificate. It is a maintenance report filed by a civilization that inherited something it did not fully understand. Beyond the stela, the Old Kingdom, the period most commonly associated with the Sphinx's creation, left extensive records at Giza. Pyramid texts, quarry marks, Administrative papyri, the names of work gangs scratched into limestone blocks, these documents describe the construction of pyramids and temples with a precision that borders on bureaucratic obsession. They name king's overseers rations of bread and beer distributed to labourers, yet none of these securely dated Old Kingdom texts explicitly describe the carving of the Sphinx. The silence is not proof of absence. Documents decay, stone is reused inscriptions, weather into illegibility. But the silence is notable, a gap in a record that is otherwise remarkably detailed, and it sits in the evidence like a missing tooth in a jawbone, functional, survivable, but impossible to ignore once you have noticed it. Radiocarbon dating adds another thread, but it is a thread that frays at the edges. The technique applies to organic material charcoal fibres bone, not to carved limestone. At the Sphinx, datable samples come from associated contexts. Mortar used in ancient repairs, debris layers in the enclosure occupation material scattered nearby. These samples cluster broadly around the Old Kingdom, and later periods confirming human activity in the area, but describing presence rather than creation. A date drawn from charcoal embedded in repair mortar tells you when the repair occurred. It does not tell you when the original surface was first exposed to air. The evidence accumulates, it does not resolve. It settles into layers, each one real, each one partial, each one waiting for the next grain to fall. There is a moment in every quiet investigation when the data stops fitting. Not dramatically, not with the clean fracture of a theory breaking in half, but with the slow, unsettling sensation of a drawer that will not close all the way. Everything inside appears to be in order, but something unseen at the back prevents the smooth slide into resolution. The Sphinx has a drawer like that. It has several, and the more carefully you examine the contents, the more clearly you feel the obstruction, not as a single object, but as an accumulation of small resistances, each one minor enough to dismiss on its own, each one adding to a pressure that the standard framework absorbs but does not fully resolve. The anomaly does not announce itself, it seeps in through the joints. Begin with the weathering profiles on the enclosure walls, because this is where the crack first became visible to modern eyes. In the early 1990s, the geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University conducted a detailed examination of the Sphinx enclosure and concluded that certain features on the walls, deep, rounded vertical channels running from top to bottom, undulating surfaces that curved inward in smooth, continuous profiles, rather than the sharp, horizontally stratified patterns expected from wind abrasion, were more consistent with prolonged water erosion than with the aeolian processes that dominate the plateau today. The claim was specific, and it was measured. Schoch did not argue that the Sphinx was built by aliens or by a lost supercivilization. He argued that the stone bore signatures of rainfall acting over an extended period, and that the last time the Giza region experienced rainfall sufficient to produce such signatures was during the earlier phases of the Holocene, roughly 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, possibly earlier, a period that predates dynastic Egypt by millennia, a period when the Sahara was not yet the Sahara, but a patchwork of grasslands, seasonal lakes and semi-arid savannas, receiving enough annual precipitation to darken stone and carve channels into exposed limestone with the patience of water that returns season after season, century after century, never rushing, never stopping. The response from Egyptology was swift and grounded in a different kind of evidence. Mark Lehner, one of the foremost authorities on the Giza Plateau, emphasized the archaeological and architectural context that places the Sphinx firmly within the 4th Dynasty construction landscape, the shared materials between the enclosure and nearby temples, the alignment with Khafra's causeway. The quarry marks the masonry styles, the integrated plan of a building program that moved millions of tons of limestone across the plateau during a concentrated period of royal ambition around 2500 BCE. Lehner did not dispute that water had touched the stone. He disputed the interpretation, arguing that the features Schoch attributed to rainfall could be explained by other mechanisms operating within the conventional timeframe salt, weathering driven by capillary moisture rising from below, episodic flash floods that strike the plateau during rare but intense storms. Even in the current arid regime, differential erosion along bedding planes where softer limestone recedes faster than harder layers, regardless of what agent does the work. The disagreement was not about whether the stone had changed. Both sides agreed on that. The disagreement was about what kind of time the changes required and what kind of climate, and whether the physical evidence could override the contextual evidence, or whether context must always hold the final weight. This is where the anomaly lives, not in one camp or the other, but in the space between them, in the fact that both readings of the same stone are internally consistent, and yet they cannot both be entirely correct without revising something fundamental about either the geological timeline or the archaeological one. The enclosure walls do carry vertical channels that are difficult to produce through wind alone. Wind-driven sand erodes horizontally, preferentially attacking softer beds, and producing the stepped layered profiles visible on countless limestone outcrops across the Egyptian desert. The vertical channels cut across these beds. They follow joints and fractures from top to bottom, deepening as they descend, widening where the rock is weaker, and their morphology does resemble runoff channels found in regions with sustained seasonal precipitation. At the same time, the Sphinx sits within a construction zone so thoroughly documented by archaeology that removing it from the 4th dynasty requires explaining why blocks from its enclosure appear in temples built during Khafra's reign, why the axis of the monument aligns with Khafra's causeway, why the surrounding landscape bears every mark of coordinated Old Kingdom quarrying, except an inscription that says the Sphinx was part of the plan. The anomaly deepens when you consider the head. The head of the Sphinx is carved from a harder, more competent layer of limestone than the body. It has retained sharper features despite being exposed to wind and sun for the entire documented history of the monument, while the body carved from softer, more variable beds has been protected by sand for long stretches, and yet appears more heavily eroded in certain areas than the constantly exposed head. If erosion were purely a function of time, the head should show more wear. It does not. This can be explained by material properties alone. Harder stone resists longer, but it also permits a different reading. That the head was recarved at a later date, reshaped from a larger, older form into the royal visage. We see today a portrait imposed upon a surface that had already endured centuries or millennia of weathering before the chisel returned. This is not proven. It is permitted by the evidence. Permission and proof occupy different rooms in the House of Knowledge, but they share a hallway, and the anomaly walks that hallway constantly, never settling into one room or the other. There is also the matter of the Sphinx Temple, the structure that sits directly in front of the monument, built from enormous limestone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons that were quarried from the enclosure itself. The temple's core blocks are massive and rough, fitted together with a simplicity that some researchers have described as archaic, as though the building predates the more refined masonry techniques visible in later Old Kingdom structures. Granite facing was added to these blocks at some point, and the granite carries stylistic markers consistent with Khafra's reign. But the core predates the facing. The question is, by how much? If the core blocks were quarried from the enclosure when the Sphinx was first carved, and if the granite facing was added later during Khafra's building program, then the temple, and by extension, the Sphinx could predate the 4th dynasty by an undetermined margin. The evidence permits this reading without requiring it, and that is precisely what makes it an anomaly rather than a revolution. It does not overthrow the framework. It unsettles it, the way a single note played slightly out of tune does not destroy a symphony, but makes the ear aware that something in the harmony is not quite resolved, that the chord wants to move somewhere it has not yet been allowed to go. Silence has texture. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything that chose not to speak. Everything that was spoken and then arrayed, everything that existed once in ink or pigment or carved relief, and then surrendered to moisture, to fire, to the patient chemistry of salt, migrating through porous stone until the surface that held a name became smooth and blank and anonymous again. The silence surrounding the Sphinx is not empty. It is full the way a sealed room is full of air you cannot see full, the way the space between stars is full of gravity. You cannot touch full the way the gap in a sentence is full of the word that was meant to go there, but never arrived. This is the silence of the record, and it is one of the most remarkable features of the most scrutinized monument on Earth, for all the text, all the stelae, all the papyri, all the graffiti scratched into nearby walls by priests and soldiers and tourists across 3,000 years of literate civilization. Not one surviving document from any period says plainly and unambiguously who carved the Great Sphinx, or when or why. Consider what does survive. The Old Kingdom left behind an extraordinary volume of written material at Giza. Quarry marks painted in red ochre on limestone blocks identify work gangs by name, the friends of Khufu, the drunkards of Menkaure, with a casualness that suggests bureaucratic routine rather than ceremonial intention. Administrative papyri recovered from Wadi al-Jarf dated to the reign of Khufu himself. Describe in meticulous detail the transport of limestone blocks across the Nile for pyramid construction, listing the names of overseers, the quantities of bread and beer distributed to labourers, the schedules of boats moving between quarries and the plateau. These documents demonstrate that the Fourth Dynasty possessed both the capacity and the habit of recording large-scale construction projects with a precision that would satisfy a modern logistics manager. They named places, they named people, they named phases of work. They kept accounts, they tracked materials, they wrote things down. And yet within this dense and detailed textual landscape, the Sphinx does not appear. No surviving Old Kingdom papyrus mentions its carving. No quarry mark on its enclosure walls names a king or a work gang responsible for its creation. No administrative record allocates rations to the labourers, who must have spent years, perhaps decades, cutting tens of thousands of cubic metres of bedrock from the ridge to release the shape within. This silence is not proof of anything. Documents decay. Papyrus is fragile, vulnerable to moisture, insects, and fire. The survival of any ancient text is a minor miracle, and the non-survival of a specific text proves only that it has not been found, not that it never existed. Scholars emphasize this point with care because the distance between absence of evidence and evidence of absence is the most dangerous gap in historical reasoning, a gap wide enough to swallow entire theories if you are not careful about where you place your feet. And yet the silence persists, and it persists in a context that makes it conspicuous. The Fourth Dynasty documented its pyramids, it documented its temples, it documented the quarrying, the hauling, the feeding, the organising of labour on a scale that rivals industrial operations. If the Sphinx was carved as part of this programme, the absence of comparable documentation is not impossible, but it is unusual. A gap that stands out the way a missing page stands out in an otherwise complete manuscript. You can read around it. You can infer what might have been written there, but you cannot pretend the page is not missing. The Dream Stealer of Thutmose IV, set between the forepaws around 1400 BCE, deepens the silence rather than breaking it. The inscription describes a prince who fell asleep in the shadow of the Sphinx and received a divine communication, but it does not name the monument's creator. The text is damaged, a crucial section near the bottom is missing, and some scholars have argued that the missing portion may have contained the name Khafre, linking the Sphinx to the Fourth Dynasty king, whose pyramid complex dominates the southern portion of the plateau. This argument is based on fragments on the partial survival of hieroglyphic signs that might be part of Khafre's cartouche, or might be something else entirely. The reading is disputed. What is not disputed is that the surviving text treats the Sphinx as something inherited, something already old, something that required clearing and care rather than explanation or attribution. The stealer speaks to the monument the way a grandchild speaks to a grandparent, whose youth is no longer remembered with reverence, with obligation, with a sense of connection that does not depend on knowing the full story. Later texts continue the pattern without altering it. New Kingdom inscriptions refer to the Sphinx as Horamakhet Horus, in the horizon, framing it as a solar deity, a guardian, a presence embedded in the religious landscape of Giza. Votive stelae placed nearby by officials and priests ask for protection, for favour, for the blessing of proximity to something powerful and old. These texts are formulaic. They locate the Sphinx within a web of devotion and ritual, but they do not narrate. They do not explain. They assume that the listener already knows what the Sphinx is, the way you assume that someone standing beside a mountain already knows it is a mountain and does not need to be told how it got there. The Sphinx, by the time these texts were written, had already passed beyond the reach of living memory and entered the realm of the self, evident a thing so old that its origin was no longer a question anyone thought to answer in writing, because the answer, if it ever existed, had already been swallowed by the same sand that periodically swallowed the body. Greek and Roman visitors encountered the monument with fresh eyes but stale information. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the pyramids in careful detail, but gave the Sphinx only passing attention, as though it were a feature of the landscape rather than a constructed object worthy of its own account. Later, writers Diodorus Siculus Pliny the Elder mention colossal statues in Egypt with varying degrees of accuracy, relying on local guides whose knowledge was already a patchwork of tradition, legend, and educated guessing. These classical sources preserve impressions, not archives. They tell us that the Sphinx was visible, that it was noteworthy, that it prompted curiosity, but they do not add a single firm date or a single builder's name to the record. The silence had already settled by their time, thick and permanent like silt, on the floor of a reservoir that no one would drain for another 2,000 years. Medieval Arabic historians al-Makrizi, al-Drisi, and others encountered the Sphinx as a relic detached from any clear origin story. Their accounts blend observation with legend, attributing the monuments of Giza variously to pre-Islamic peoples, to magical traditions, to rulers whose names shift between texts like sand between dunes. These writings are valuable not for their historical accuracy, but for what they reveal about the state of cultural memory. By the 15th century CE, the Sphinx had been orphaned. It belonged to everyone and to no one. Its silence had become so complete, so thoroughly absorbed into the landscape that even the act of speculating about its origin had become a literary genre rather than a historical investigation. The silence by then was not a gap in the record. It was the record. And it remains the record today, not because no one has looked, not because no one has tried, but because the stone that holds the shape does not hold the name, and the sand that buried the body also buried whatever document, if any, ever existed, might once have told us who first lifted a copper chisel against that ridge of ancient seabed, and began stroke by patient stroke to release the form that the plateau had been carrying inside itself for 40 million years. There was a time before the desert. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry dressed as science to make a narrative more comfortable to hold. This is the geological and climatological record speaking plainly in the language of pollen trapped in lake sediments, in the language of fossilized root systems branching through soil that no longer exists, in the language of dried riverbeds, etched into satellite imagery like the veins on the back of an ancient hand, visible, traceable, undeniable, and dry. Before the Sahara was the Sahara, it was something else entirely. And if you want to understand why the question of the Sphinx's age refuses to resolve into a single comfortable number, you must first travel backward through the sand, past the dynasties and the kingdoms and the calendars, into a period that has no name in most history books, because it predates the invention of history itself. The Holocene began roughly 11,700 years ago, at the close of the last glacial period, when ice sheets that had covered much of northern Europe and North America began their long, uneven retreat, and the planet's climate systems reorganized themselves in ways that transformed landscapes across every continent. In North Africa, this reorganization brought rain, not the catastrophic rain of myth and flood narrative, but the slow, seasonal, persistent rain of a monsoon belt that shifted northward as the Earth's orbital parameters changed, pulling moisture from the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, across regions that had been arid for tens of thousands of years. The Sahara greened. Lakes formed in basins that are now nothing but salt flats and gravel. Grassland spread across what is today the most inhospitable desert on Earth, supporting populations of hippopotamus, crocodile, elephant, giraffe, and the human communities that hunted and herded among them. This period is sometimes called the African Humid Period, or more evocatively the Green Sahara, and its reality is not speculative. It is documented in sediment cores pulled from the bottoms of ancient lake beds, in pollen records that show the advance and retreat of vegetation zones across thousands of years, in rock art carved into cliff faces in what is now the Libyan desert, depicting swimmers, cattle, and rainfall in a landscape that has not seen meaningful precipitation in 5,000 years. The Giza Plateau sat at the northeastern edge of this transformation. It was never a rainforest. It was never a swamp. But during the earlier phases of the Holocene, particularly between roughly 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, the region received significantly more rainfall than it does today, enough to sustain seasonal grasses enough to fill shallow wadis with temporary streams after storms enough to darken exposed limestone surfaces with repeated wetting and drying cycles that slowly dissolved calcium carbonate and widened the microscopic pores and fractures that give the stone its texture. The plateau during this period would have looked different from the plateau you see tonight. The sand would have been thinner, held in place by root systems. The air would have carried more moisture. The ridge from which the Sphinx was eventually carved, or from which it had perhaps already been carved, would have stood against a horizon softened by haze, rather than the hard, crystalline edge of pure desert sky. The stone would have been wetter, the nights would have been cooler, the erosion would have been different. This is the epoch that the geological argument reaches toward when it suggests that the Sphinx may predate dynastic Egypt. Not a specific year, not a specific civilization, but a climatic window, a period during which the conditions necessary to produce certain weathering features on the enclosure walls would have been present in a way that they are not present today, and have not been present for thousands of years. The vertical channels, the rounded profiles, the deep undulations that cut across bedding planes rather than following them. These features, if they are indeed the product of sustained water erosion, rather than wind or salt, point backward in time toward a Giza that existed before the first hieroglyph was carved, before the first mud brick was laid along the Nile, before the concept of a pharaoh or a dynasty or a kingdom had entered the human imagination. They point toward a forgotten epoch, a chapter of human and geological time that left its signature on stone but not on paper, because paper did not yet exist. And the people who lived during that epoch, if they carved anything, if they built anything, if they shaped the ridge into a form that later generations would inherit and reshape, and claim as their own, left no text, no name, no administrative record, only the stone itself, and the marks that time and water and wind have made upon it. Imagine the plateau during that epoch not as an exercise in fantasy, but as an exercise in reconstruction based on available data. The Nile, swollen by greater rainfall upstream, would have flooded more broadly and more predictably, its annual inundation reaching closer to the base of the plateau than it does today. The flood plain would have been wider, greener, more densely populated with the plants and animals that depend on seasonal water. The ridge where the Sphinx sits would have been accessible from the valley below by a shorter walk across wetter ground. If people were present, and the archaeological record confirms human presence in the Nile Valley, stretching back tens of thousands of years, they would have known this ridge intimately, would have quarried its stone for tools and shelters, would have watched its surface change with the seasons, would have noticed how rain carved channels and how wind shaped hollows and how the limestone responded differently depending on which bed was exposed. They would have had the knowledge. Whether they had the organisation, the motivation and the vision to carve a monument of this scale is another question, a question that the stone permits but does not answer. The forgotten epoch does not prove that the Sphinx is older than dynastic Egypt. It establishes that conditions existed under which an older carving date is climatologically plausible. It opens a window. It does not tell us what passed through it. But the window itself is real, documented in sediment and pollen and fossilized bone, and it stretches across millennia during which the plateau was a different place subjected to different forces, inhabited by people whose lives left traces in the ground but not in the written record. The silence of that epoch is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of a world that did not yet have the tools to narrate itself, a world that spoke only in stone and soil, and the slow reshaping of surfaces exposed to a sky that carried more rain than the sky carries now. The forgotten epoch whispers, and the stone, patient and indifferent, holds whatever it was told. The earth breathes, not in the way lungs breathe, not with the rhythm of seconds and minutes, but in the way oceans breathe, in vast, slow undulations that span centuries and millennia, exhaling warmth across continents for 1,000 years, and then inhaling it back, drawing moisture from the surface, pulling green things underground, turning rivers into memories and lakes into salt. The breath is not metaphorical, it is orbital, it is axial. It is the product of wobbles and tilts in the planet's rotation that shift the distribution of sunlight across latitudes with a regularity that would be beautiful if it were not on the scale of civilization so utterly indifferent to what lives and dies during each cycle. The Earth does not reset because something went wrong. It resets because resetting is what it does. The catastrophe is not the exception. The catastrophe is the exhalation. The transition from the African humid period to the arid Sahara we know today was not a single event. It was a process long, uneven, and merciless, in the way that only slow things can be merciless, because they do not offer a moment of crisis around which resistance can organise. The monsoon belt that had carried rain across North Africa for thousands of years began to retreat southward as the Earth's orbital precession shifted the timing and intensity of solar heating in the northern hemisphere. The retreat was not linear. There were centuries of partial recovery decades when the rain seemed to return in seasons that offered false reassurance. But the trend was downward, and the landscape responded with the obedience of something that has no choice. Lakes shrank. Grasslands thinned. The soil that had held sand in place lost its roots, and the sand began to move not with the drama of a storm but with the patience of a tide advancing a few meters each year, burying what had been open ground, filling depressions, smoothing contours, transforming a living landscape into an archive of its former self sealed beneath a layer of fine wind-sorted grains that would not be disturbed for thousands of years. The Giza plateau experienced this transition from its position at the desert margin close enough to the Nile to retain a corridor of life high enough above the floodplain to feel the drying more acutely than the valley below. The ridge from which the Sphinx was carved, whether it had already been carved by that time or not, would have watched the grasslands retreat, would have felt the rain come less frequently, would have registered the change not as an event, but as a gradual alteration in the chemistry of its own surface. Fewer wetting cycles meant slower dissolution of calcium carbonate. Less moisture in the air meant fewer salt crystals blooming in the pores. More exposed sand meant more abrasion at the base, more scouring against the lower courses, more of the horizontal stratified erosion pattern that characterizes wind-dominated environments. The stone did not know that the world was changing. It simply changed with it, the way a face changes over decades without the owner noticing, until they see an old photograph and realize that the person they were is no longer the person they are. This is the reset. Not a flood, not a meteor, not a volcanic winter. Though all of these have punctuated Earth's history at various points, but something quieter, and in many ways more profound, the slow withdrawal of the conditions that made a particular way of life possible. The communities that had thrived across the Green Sahara did not vanish in a single generation. They migrated, contracted, adapted, and in many cases converged on the one resource that remained reliable, the Nile. The river became a refuge, a spine along which populations concentrated and organized as the surrounding land dried and emptied. Some researchers have argued that this concentration was itself a catalyst for the social complexity that would eventually produce dynastic Egypt, that the pharaohs and the pyramids and the elaborate bureaucracy of the Old Kingdom were not the product of a civilization arising from nothing but the product of a civilization compressed forced by climate into a narrow corridor where cooperation and hierarchy became not luxuries but necessities for survival. If this reading is correct, and the archaeological record supports it in broad strokes, showing increasing settlement density along the Nile during the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, then the monuments of Giza are not the beginning of a story, but a chapter written after a long and largely unrecorded prologue. The reset did not destroy what came before, it transformed it. It pushed populations into new configurations, forced the development of new organizational structures, and buried the landscapes where earlier chapters had unfolded beneath a mantle of sand so thick and so persistent that only geology and satellite imagery can now read what lies beneath. The Sphinx in this framework sits at the boundary between the prologue and the chapter, a monument that may belong entirely to the chapter as mainstream Egyptology maintains, or that may carry within its stone some echo of the prologue, some residue of the epoch that the reset erased from the surface, but could not erase from the bedrock. The reset is not a punishment. It is a rhythm. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica record dozens of such oscillations over the past 100,000 years, each one reorganizing climate zones, each one shifting the boundaries between habitable and uninhabitable land, each one producing winners and losers among the species and the cultures caught in the transition. The Younger Dryas, a sudden cold snap around 12,800 years ago that lasted over a millennium, interrupted the warming trend that followed the last glacial maximum and plunged much of the northern hemisphere back into near-glacial conditions before releasing it again into the warmth that would eventually produce the African humid period. The 8.2 kilo-year event, a brief but sharp cooling episode around 6,200 BCE, disrupted early agricultural communities across the Near East and may have accelerated the abandonment of marginal lands in North Africa. These events are not anomalies. They are the pulse. They are the planet's heartbeat measured in centuries rather than seconds, and every monument that humanity has ever built, every pyramid, every temple, every cathedral, every city exists in the pause between beats in the temporary stillness that we mistake for permanence because our lives are too short to feel the next contraction coming. The Sphinx sits in one of those pauses. The sand that buries it is the residue of the last exhalation. The stone that forms it remembers the breath before. And the question of its age is in the end a question about which breath it belongs to, the one we can document, or the one we can only infer from the shape of what was left behind when the air went still. The past does not disappear. It recedes the way a sound recedes, not into nothing, but into the texture of the air itself, folding into background noise, blending with newer vibrations until it becomes indistinguishable from the present, unless you know how to listen for it, unless you have trained your ear to isolate the frequency that no longer calls attention to itself, but has never actually stopped resonating. The Sphinx is an echo, not of a single voice or a single moment, but of a process so long and so layered that its reverberations pass through stone, through soil, through the inherited habits of hands that carve and build and repair, without always knowing why they choose the forms they choose, or why certain shapes feel sacred before anyone explains that they are. Echoes do not require understanding. They require only a medium through which to travel, and stone, dense, slow, patient stone is among the finest media that time has ever found. The echo begins in the rock itself. The limestone of the Giza plateau is not merely a building material. It is a biological archive, a compressed record of life that flourished in a shallow Eocene sea 50 million years ago. Every block quarried from the ridge contains the fossilized remains of nummulites, coin shaped foraminifera, whose shells accumulated on the seafloor in such density that they constitute the bulk of the stone. When a mason in the 4th dynasty struck a copper chisel against the enclosure wall, the force travelled through a medium composed of ancient organisms, and the chip that fell away carried within it a cross-section of a world that had ended tens of millions of years before the mason was born. The echo of that older world is embedded in every surface of the monument. It is not symbolic, it is structural. The porosity of the stone, its tendency to erode unevenly, its response to moisture and salt. All of these properties are inherited from the conditions under which those organisms lived and died, and were compressed into rock. The Sphinx, whatever its age, is made of time. Not decorated with it, not situated within it, but composed of it, grain by grain, shell by shell, layer by layer, each molecule carrying the memory of a pressure applied so long ago that the concept of human civilization had not yet entered the realm of the possible. But the echo extends beyond geology. It extends into the way human beings have interacted with this particular ridge across millennia, each generation responding to the shape left by the one before each response, adding a new layer of intention to a form that may have begun as something quite different from what it eventually became. Consider the possibility permitted by evidence proven by none that the original carving was not a sphinx at all, not a human-headed lion, but something older, something shaped by hands working in a tradition that did not survive into the dynastic period, a form that was later recarved, refined, given a royal face and a royal headdress, and absorbed into the symbolic vocabulary of a kingdom that found it easier to claim the monument than to explain it. If this happened, and the disproportionately small head relative to the massive body has been noted by researchers as potentially consistent with recutting, then the Sphinx as we see it is itself an echo of an echo, a form laid over a form, a meaning laid over a meaning, each layer partially visible through the one above it, the way a palimpsest preserves the ghost of earlier writing beneath the text that replaced it. The echo resonates in architecture. The Sphinx temple, built from enormous core blocks quarried directly from the enclosure, represents a construction technique that some researchers describe as archaic, in its simplicity, massive stones, fitted together with minimal shaping relying on weight and scale rather than precision joinery. This technique echoes practices found in megalithic traditions across the ancient world, from the Cyclopean walls of Mycenae to the massive platforms of Baalbek structures, whose core elements are so large and so simply assembled that they seem to belong to a different conception of building than the refined masonry that came later. The granite facing added to the Sphinx temple during what is conventionally identified as Khafra's reign sits on top of these core blocks like a veneer, a cosmetic layer applied to a structural skeleton that may have existed before the veneer was conceived. The echo here is architectural, a building method that persists in the bones of the structure even after the surface has been updated to reflect a newer aesthetic, a newer theology, a newer king's desire to be associated with something powerful and old. The echo resonates in orientation. The Sphinx faces east toward the equinoctial sunrise, a direction charged with meaning in Egyptian cosmology, but not exclusively Egyptian in its significance. Solar orientation appears in monumental architecture across cultures and across millennia, in the passage graves of Neolithic Ireland, in the temple complexes of Malta, in the stone circles of the British Isles, in the ceremonial platforms of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, a site whose carved pillars and circular enclosures date to approximately 10,000 BCE millennia, before the conventional date assigned to the Sphinx. These structures do not share a builder or a blueprint. They share a response, a recognition that the movement of the sun across the sky is the most reliable rhythm available to a species trying to orient itself within a world that offers no other fixed points. The echo is not of a specific tradition passed from one culture to another, but of a deeper pattern, a gravitational pull towards solar alignment that seems to emerge independently wherever human communities invest effort in shaping stone on a monumental scale. The Sphinx participates in this pattern. It does not prove connection. It demonstrates resonance the way two strings tuned to the same frequency will vibrate in sympathy even when no one has plucked the second string. The echo resonates in ritual. The dream stealer of Thutmose IV describes a practice sleeping in the shadow of the monument to receive divine communication that belongs to a category of sacred behavior, documented across many ancient cultures. The incubation dream, the deliberate seeking of supernatural contact through proximity to a place or an object perceived as charged with power older than the seeker. The New Kingdom priests who tended the Sphinx, who placed offerings between its paws and carved votive stele asking for protection, were not performing rituals invented from nothing. They were continuing a practice whose origins they themselves may not have known, responding to a pull that the monument exerted, not because someone told them it was sacred, but because the stone itself, by its scale and its age and its inscrutable silence, generated the conditions under which sacredness arises spontaneously, the way a cave generates reverence without instruction, the way a very old tree commands stillness without speaking. The ritual is an echo of the first human response to the form, whatever that form originally was, whenever that response first occurred. It has been repeated, modified, formalized, and institutionalized across thousands of years, but beneath the layers of theology and bureaucracy, the original impulse persists. The impulse to approach something ancient, to sit in its shadow, to listen for whatever the stone might say, if the mind becomes quiet enough to hear it. The echo resonates in you. You're listening to this now in the dark, drawn to a question about a monument you may never have touched. And the fact that you are here attending to this question is itself a continuation of the same pattern that brought Thutmose to the shadow of the head, that brought Caviglia to dig through the sand, that brought Shock to map the enclosure walls. The question echoes. It has been echoing for as long as the monument has been visible. Each generation hears it differently, frames it differently, brings different tools and different assumptions to the task of answering it. But the question itself does not change. It remains the same question, reverberating through stone and time and human curiosity, growing neither louder nor softer, simply persisting the way an echo persists in a canyon, long after the voice that produced it has fallen silent, not because the canyon remembers the voice, but because the shape of the walls will not let the sound die. There is a shape that history makes when you step far enough back to see it whole. It is not a line. Lines are the invention of civilizations that believe they are going somewhere, that progresses a direction rather than a phase, that the place they stand is further along than the place they came from. From close range, history does look linear. One king follows another one, technology replaces the last buildings grow taller, records grow longer, and the assumption that tomorrow will exceed today becomes so deeply embedded in the culture that it stops being an assumption and becomes an atmosphere invisible, breathed without thought. But from a distance, the kind of distance that geology provides, the kind of distance that a limestone ridge records in its layered beds, history does not look like a line at all. It looks like a wave. It looks like a breath. It looks like a circle that does not quite close each revolution, passing near the point where it began, but not exactly through it, producing a spiral, rather than a loop, a pattern that repeats without duplicating, that rhymes, without copying, that returns to familiar territory wearing unfamiliar clothes. The Sphinx sits at a point on that spiral where the pattern becomes visible if you're willing to look at it with the right scale of attention. The 4th dynasty of Egypt, the period most commonly associated with the monument's creation, represents a peak, a concentrated burst of monumental construction that produced 3 of the largest stone structures ever built within the span of roughly a century. The organizational capacity required to quarry, transport, shape, and assemble millions of limestone blocks into precise geometric forms implies a society operating at an extraordinary level of coordination, administrative, logistical, agricultural, and demographic. This capacity did not appear from nothing. It was the product of centuries of development of smaller projects that tested techniques and trained labor forces of social structures that evolved to manage increasing complexity. And it did not last. Within a few centuries of Khufu's reign, the scale of pyramid construction declined. Resources shifted, priorities changed. The centralized power that had made such projects possible fragmented, and Egypt entered what historians call the First Intermediate Period, a time of regional division, reduced monumental building and political instability that lasted roughly a century and a half before the Middle Kingdom consolidated power again and a new phase of construction began. This is the pattern. Rise, peak, decline, reorganization, rise again. It is visible not only in Egypt, but in every civilization that has left a material record long enough to trace. The Sumerians built ziggurats and then watched their cities silt up and empty. The Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley produced planned cities with standardized brick and sophisticated drainage, and then contracted and dispersed over centuries for reasons still debated. Climate shift, river migration as the slow withdrawal of the conditions that had made density possible. The Maya built monumental complexes across the Yucatan, calculated astronomical cycles with a precision that still astonishes, and then abandoned their great cities to the jungle in a process that unfolded over generations rather than days. The Romans engineered aqueducts and roads and amphitheatres across 3 continents, and then watched the system that maintained them dissolve under the weight of its own complexity, its borders too long, its administration too layered, its resources too stretched to sustain the coherence that had made the engineering possible in the first place. Each of these civilizations believed at its peak that it was different. Each assumed that its achievements were permanent. Each was wrong, not because of moral failure or divine punishment, but because the pattern does not permit permanence. The wave rises, the wave falls, the energy does not disappear. It redistributes. What makes the Sphinx interesting within this pattern is not that it may be older than its conventional date, though that question remains open, but that it has survived enough cycles to make the pattern visible in a single object. If the monument was carved during the 4th dynasty, it has already passed through the decline of the Old Kingdom, the fragmentation of the First Intermediate Period, the consolidation of the Middle Kingdom, the expansion of the New Kingdom, the contraction of the 3rd Intermediate Period, the foreign rule of the Late Period, the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Roman occupation, the Arab conquest, the Ottoman administration, and the modern era. Each of these phases brought different attitudes toward the monument, reverence, neglect, restoration, exploitation, scholarship, and each left material traces on its surface. The Sphinx has been carved, buried, cleared, repaired, buried again, cleared again, photographed, scanned, and debated by civilizations that could not have imagined one another's existence. It has outlasted every system that claimed it. It persists not because it was protected by any single authority, but because the stone is hard enough, and the form is compelling enough to survive the intervals between authorities, the gaps when no one is clearing the sand, the centuries when the body disappears beneath the plateau's slow exhalation of dust, and only the head remains visible watching the sunrise with the patience of something that has seen this before. If the monument is older than the 4th dynasty, if it belongs to the forgotten epoch, to the Green Sahara, to a period of human activity that predates the written record, then the pattern deepens further. It suggests that the cycle of rise and decline that we observe in documented history was already operating before documentation began, that civilizations capable of monumental effort existed and faded, and were absorbed into the landscape long before anyone was keeping accounts or carving royal names into granite. This is not a radical idea. It is a logical extension of what the pattern itself implies. If the cycle repeats, it repeats in both directions, forward into the future and backward into the past. The earliest cycle we can document is not necessarily the earliest cycle that occurred. It is simply the earliest one that left traces legible to our current methods of reading. Older traces may exist in forms we have not yet learned to interpret, or in forms so thoroughly weathered that they have crossed the threshold between artifact and geology, between intention and erosion, between something someone made and something the earth reclaimed so completely that only the most sensitive instruments and the most open minds can detect the difference. The pattern does not predict. It does not tell us what will happen next or when the current cycle will peak or decline. It tells us only that the wave has risen before and fallen before and risen again, and that each time it rises, the people standing on the crest believe they can see farther than anyone has ever seen. They are right, but they are also standing on the highest point before the descent, and the view from the top does not include the valley that follows. The Sphinx has seen the valley, it has been buried in it, and it has emerged again each time a little more worn, a little more silent, a little more patient, as though the stone itself has learned what the civilizations that carved and cleared and worshipped it could not, that the pattern is not something to resist or to fear. It is simply the shape that time makes when it moves through stone, through sand, through the brief and brilliant efforts of a species that builds monuments to permanence on a planet that has never promised any. The earth does not warn the way humans warn with words, with sirens, with the urgency of a voice raised against approaching danger. The earth warns the way, limestone warns the way, sediment warns the way, a hairline fracture in a load-bearing wall warns silently structurally through changes in material properties that are measurable long before they become visible through shifts so gradual that they register not as events but as tendencies, not as crises, but as accumulations, not as alarms, but as the slow tightening of conditions that were once loose and forgiving and are becoming year by year, century by century less so. The warning is always present, it is always legible, and it is almost always ignored, not because the species receiving it is stupid, but because the species receiving it lives on a different timescale than the one on which the warning operates, and by the time the signal crosses from geological time into human time, the window for response has usually narrowed to something that feels less like a warning and more like a verdict. The Giza plateau carries warnings written in its own surface. The transition from the African humid period to the current arid regime, the slow withdrawal of rain, the retreat of vegetation, the advance of sand left signatures in the stone that can be read as a record of environmental change operating across millennia. The enclosure walls of the Sphinx, whatever their weathering features, ultimately tell us about the monument's age, undeniably tell us about the climate that acted upon them. Rounded profiles and dissolution features in the upper courses speak of a time when water was present more frequently than it is today. Sharp, horizontally stratified erosion in the lower courses, where wind-driven sand concentrated its force, speaks of the regime that replaced it. The transition between these signatures is not a clean line. It is a gradient, a zone of overlap where both processes left marks on the same stone, sometimes on the same surface, producing a palimpsest of climate history that the untrained eye reads as simple decay, but that the geologist reads as a story of transformation, a landscape drying a rhythm, slowing a system that had sustained life across a vast region, gradually withdrawing its support, This is a warning, though it was not issued as one. The communities that lived through the arudification of North Africa did not receive a memo informing them that the monsoon belt was shifting southward at a rate of a few kilometres per century. They experienced it as a series of bad seasons, a year when the rains came late, a decade when the pasture thinned, a generation when the lake that had always been there began to shrink, and the animals that had always gathered at its edges began to move south, and the children who had grown up swimming in its shallows found themselves standing on cracked mud, wondering what had changed. The warning was in the soil. The warning was in the pollen count. The warning was in the water table dropping centimetre by centimetre beneath the surface in the salt crusts, forming on stones that had once been washed clean by seasonal rain, in the slow replacement of grass by bare ground and bare ground by sand. Each of these signals was individually small, individually ambiguous, individually easy to attribute to normal variation rather than systemic shift. Together they constituted a transformation that would render an entire region uninhabitable, within a span of centuries long enough to be invisible within a single lifetime, short enough to be catastrophic across 10. The pattern has repeated since in forms that the modern world is better equipped to measure, but not necessarily better equipped to heed. Ice cores from Greenland record the 8.2 kilo-year event, a sudden cooling episode around 6200 BCE that disrupted early agricultural communities across the Near East, and may have contributed to population movements and settlement abandonment in regions that had only recently been colonized by farming peoples. Sediment records from the Mediterranean capture periods of increased dust deposition, corresponding to arid phases in North Africa, each pulse reflecting a landscape losing its grip on its own soil. Tree ring chronologies from Europe and North America reveal clusters of narrow rings, years of reduced growth, that coincide with volcanic eruptions, solar minima, and climatic oscillations, whose effects rippled through ecosystems and economies with a delay that made causation difficult to establish at the time but unmistakable in retrospect. The warnings were there. They were written in the rings. They were written in the dust. They were written in the ice. They were not read until centuries after the societies they might have helped had already adapted, migrated, collapsed, or transformed into something else entirely. The Sphinx itself embodies this dynamic. Its surface is a record of warnings received and not received, of changes that accumulated beyond the threshold of human attention, and then became permanent features of the monument. The cement-based mortars applied during 20th century repairs were intended as protection. They became agents of accelerated decay, trapping moisture and salts against the very stone they were meant to preserve, causing flaking and crumbling in zones where the original surface had survived thousands of years of natural weathering. The clearing campaigns that exposed the body after centuries of burial were undertaken as acts of rescue. They became catalysts for deterioration, subjecting stone that had been insulated by sand to temperature swings, wind abrasion, and chemical processes that the burial had suppressed. Each intervention was rational within its own context. Each produced consequences that were not anticipated, because the system being intervened upon operated on a time scale longer than the planning horizon of the interveners. The warning was in the stone's response to the mortar. The warning was in the acceleration of surface loss after clearance. The warning was legible within decades, but the frameworks that produced the interventions did not include mechanisms for reading it quickly enough. This is what warnings look like when they come from the earth rather than from human institutions. They are slow. They are structural. They do not expire. A warning encoded in limestone does not lose its relevance after a news cycle. It remains present in the surface, in the fracture, in the salt crystal, blooming inside a pore available to anyone who examines the stone with sufficient care and sufficient humility. The plateau is issuing warnings now about moisture migration, about salt damage, about the long-term consequences of exposing ancient surfaces to modern atmospheric conditions. Conservation reports document these warnings in technical language. Recommendations are made. Some are followed, others are deferred. The stone continues to change, recording each decision and each deferral with the same indifferent fidelity with which it recorded the retreat of the rains 5,000 years ago. The warning does not insist. The warning does not repeat itself in louder tones. It simply persists, written into the material, waiting for a reader patient enough to take it seriously before the next layer of consequence settles into place, and the opportunity to respond passes from the realm of the possible into the realm of the geological record, where it will be legible to future investigators, but useful to no one. The sky has never been separate from the ground. This is not a spiritual claim. It is a mechanical one, a gravitational one, a fact written into the orbital parameters of a planet whose axial tilt and elliptical path around a medium-sized star determine where rain falls, where ice forms, where deserts expand, and where limestone weathers at rates that differ by fractions of a millimetre per century, depending on which face of the stone points toward the sun, and which face points away. The sky shapes the earth. The way a hand shapes clay, not through a single gesture, but through sustained repetitive contact season after season, millennium after millennium, the angle of sunlight shifting imperceptibly as the planet's axis traces a slow circle against the background of stars, completing one full precession every 26,000 years, a motion so gradual that no human lifetime can perceive it directly, but so consequential that it has rearranged climate zones, redirected monsoons, advanced and retreated ice sheets, and altered the conditions under which every monument on the surface of the earth was built, maintained, buried, or abandoned. The sky is not above the Sphinx. The sky is in it, encoded in the weathering patterns that record how sunlight and moisture interacted with calcium carbonate across epochs defined not by kings, but by orbital mechanics. Precession is the slow wobble of the Earth's rotational axis caused by the gravitational pull of the Sun and Moon on the planet's equatorial bulge. Its effect on climate is indirect but profound. As the axis shifts, the timing of the seasons relative to the Earth's position in its orbit changes. When the northern hemisphere's summer coincides with the closest approach to the Sun, perihelion summers are hotter and winters are cooler, increasing the temperature contrast that drives monsoon circulation. When the alignment reverses as it does over roughly 13,000 years, summers cool and monsoons weaken. The African humid period, the green Sahara that may be relevant to the Sphinx's weathering history, was driven in part by this mechanism. The orbital configuration that brought increased summer solar radiation to the northern hemisphere strengthened the West African monsoon, pushing its rain belt northward across what is now desert. As precession continued and the configuration shifted, the monsoon retreated. The Sahara dried. The stone on the Giza plateau entered a new weathering regime. The sky, through the slow geometry of orbital motion, wrote a climate chapter on the surface of the limestone that geologists now attempt to read as evidence for or against an older date of carving. The Sphinx faces east. This orientation has been measured with modern instruments and confirmed across multiple surveys. It aligns closely with the equinoctial sunrise, the point on the horizon where the sun appears on the 2 days each year when day and night are of equal length. This alignment is shared by many ancient structures across the world, from the megalithic temples of Najdra on Malta to the passage tomb of Newgrange in Ireland, from the temple complexes of Angkor Wat in Cambodia to the ceremonial platforms of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. Solar orientation appears to be one of the most fundamental impulses of monumental architecture, a response so deeply embedded in the human relationship with the sky that it surfaces independently across cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, as though the act of building something permanent on the surface of the earth naturally produces the desire to connect it to the most permanent thing visible in the sky, the path of the sun, the one rhythm that has never failed, the one clock that has never stopped. But the sky is not fixed. The equinoctial sunrise point remains constant relative to the cardinal directions, but the stars behind it shift as precession carries the Earth's axis through its 26,000-year circle. The constellation that rises with the sun at the spring equinox changes over millennia, a slow procession through the zodiac that ancient astronomers in several cultures appear to have tracked, though the evidence for this tracking is debated, and the methods used to infer it are sensitive to assumptions about what ancient observers intended when they aligned their monuments to the sky. Some researchers have proposed that the Sphinx was originally oriented not merely to the equinoctial sunrise, but to a specific constellation, Leo the Lion, at a time when that constellation rose heliacally at the spring equinox, a configuration that last occurred around 10,500 BCE. This proposal is evocative. It connects the lion form of the monument to a celestial counterpart, suggests a date consistent with the earlier phases of the African humid period, and offers a framework in which the Sphinx functions as an astronomical marker embedded in the landscape with intentional precision. It is also speculative. The alignment depends on assumptions about the original form of the monument. Was it always a lion, or was the body recarved? And about the sophistication of astronomical observation among populations that left no written record of their skywatching. Without textual confirmation, without an inscription that says this monument marks the rising of this star at this season, the alignment remains a geometric observation in search of a cultural context that may or may not have existed. What is not speculative is the relationship between the sky and the stone at the level of physical process. The angle at which sunlight strikes the enclosure walls determines how quickly different surfaces heat and cool, how rapidly moisture evaporates where thermal stress concentrates, and how salt crystals behave in the pores of the limestone. South-facing surfaces receive more direct solar radiation and undergo wider temperature swings than north-facing surfaces. East-facing surfaces warm first in the morning when the stone is coolest, and condensation is most likely. These differences, compounded over centuries and millennia, produce measurable variations in erosion rate and surface morphology. The sky does not merely illuminate the stone, it participates in shaping it, driving the thermal and chemical cycles that slowly transform carved surfaces into weathered ones, transferring energy from a star 93 million miles away into the microscopic expansion and contraction of calcite crystals embedded in a ridge of Eocene seabed on the western edge of the Nile Delta. The Earth responds to the sky the way stone responds to temperature, not instantly, not visibly, but cumulatively, through processes that operate below the threshold of perception and above the threshold of consequence. The monsoons that greened the Sahara were driven by orbital parameters. The aridification that buried the Sphinx was driven by their reversal. The weathering patterns that now fuel the debate about the monument's age were produced by the interaction of sky-driven climate with earth-bound stone over a duration that exceeds the span of any written record. Sky and earth are not separate subjects. They are a single system viewed from two directions, one looking up, the other looking down, and the Sphinx sits at the point where both gazes converge, a monument carved from the earth and oriented toward the sky, shaped by forces that originate in orbital mechanics and terminate in the slow dissolution of calcium carbonate, connecting the geometry of the solar system to the texture of a stone surface that a human hand can touch, if the hand is patient enough to feel what the stone has been recording since long before anyone thought to ask what it means. You have been here before. Not in this body, not in this life, not with these particular hands or this particular name, but in the way that water has been here before, cycling through cloud and rain and river and ocean and cloud again, never the same molecule in the same configuration twice, but always water, always participating in the same circulation, always returning to the places that the shape of the land and the pull of gravity make inevitable. The Sphinx has seen this return many times. It has watched the sand rise and fall like a tide measured in centuries rather than hours. It has felt hands arrive with tools and intentions clear. The enclosure repair, the damage lay offerings between the pores, and then withdraw, sometimes gradually, sometimes abruptly, leaving the monument to the wind and the silence and the slow repossession of the desert. And then always the hands return. Different hands, different languages, different tools, but the same gesture, the same impulse, the same recognition that something here requires attention, that something here refuses to be forgotten, that the shape in the stone exerts a gravity of its own that pulls human curiosity back, across the centuries the way the moon pulls water across the surface of the sea. The cycle of burial and clearance is the most visible form of this return, and it is documented with increasing detail across the historical record. Thutmose IV cleared the sand around 1400 BCE, motivated by a dream and a divine promise. The Sate pharaohs of the 26th dynasty, ruling 1,000 years later, undertook their own restorations, adding masonry and inscriptions that framed the monument within the religious vocabulary of their era, Roman administrators governing Egypt as a province of an empire whose centre lay across the Mediterranean maintained access to the Sphinx for reasons that blended tourism with political symbolism. The monument by then was already a landmark, a destination, a place where visitors came to marvel and to carve their names into the stone as proof of having stood in the presence of something older than Rome itself. After the Roman period, maintenance declined and the sand advanced again, burying the body until only the head protruded above the plateau like a stone island in a sea of dust. Medieval travellers described this head with a mixture of awe and unease, unable to place it within any framework they understood, attributing it to magicians or pre-Islamic kings, or forces that operated outside the categories of their theology. And then the clearing resumed. Caviglia in 1817, Mariette in the mid-19th century, berets in the 1920s and 1930s, each campaign uncovering a little more, each campaign exposing surfaces that had been sealed for centuries, each campaign altering the conditions under which the stone would weather for the next phase of its existence. The return is not limited to the physical act of clearing sand. It operates at the level of attention of curiosity of the questions that each generation brings to the monument and that the monument absorbs without answering. The Fourth Dynasty builders, if they were the builders, approached the ridge with the question of form. What shape can be released from this stone? What figure can emerge from the removal of everything that is not the figure? The New Kingdom priests approached with the question of meaning. What power resides here? What divine presence inhabits this shape? What obligations does proximity impose? The Greek and Roman visitors approached with the question of wonder. What civilization produced this? How old is it? What does it signify about the capabilities of a people who are no longer present to explain themselves? The medieval Arabic historians approached with the question of memory. What do we know about this? What have we forgotten? What can be recovered from the fragments that remain? The modern geologists and archaeologists approach with the question of evidence. What can the stone tell us? What can the record support? What conclusions are warranted? And what conclusions exceed the data? Each question is different. Each arises from a different cultural moment and a different set of tools. But each is a form of return, a coming back to the same stone, the same enclosure, the same silent shape, with the conviction that something important remains to be understood, and that the effort of understanding is worth the journey. The return operates in the stone itself. Limestone is not inert. It participates in cycles of dissolution and redeposition that move calcium carbonate through the rock in response to moisture temperature and chemical gradients. Water enters the stone, dissolves mineral material, carries it through pores and fractures, and redeposits it elsewhere as conditions change. Over long periods, this process can redistribute the substance of the rock, hardening some surfaces while weakening others, creating case-hardened rinds that resist erosion until they crack and expose the softer material beneath. The stone returns its own substance to itself, recycling its components through the same matrix, never losing material entirely but rearranging it in patterns that reflect the environmental conditions acting on the surface at any given time. Erosion is not loss in the absolute sense, it is redistribution. The calcium carbonate that dissolves from the enclosure wall does not vanish. It migrates into the soil, into the groundwater, into the capillary network of adjacent stone, and it reappears as cement, as crust, as the thin mineral film that coats surfaces exposed to dew and evaporation. The stone cycles through itself, the way water cycles through the atmosphere, the way attention cycles through the monument, the way the question of age cycles through the disciplines that study. It never resolved, never abandoned, always returning in a slightly different form. There is comfort in the return, though it is not the comfort of answers. It is the comfort of continuity, of knowing that the process does not end even when individual participants withdraw. The hands that cleared the sand in the 15th century BCE are gone. The hands that cleared it in the 19th century CE are gone. The hands that will clear it next, or that will choose perhaps to let the sand return as a form of protection, do not yet know they will be called. But they will come. The cycle ensures it. The shape in the stone ensures it. The gravity of the question ensures it. Something about this monument resists completion, resists the closure that would allow attention to move elsewhere permanently. It returns us to itself the way a recurring dream returns the sleeper to the same room, the same corridor, the same door that will not open, but that the dreamer cannot stop approaching, not because the door holds something terrifying, but because the act of approaching it, of standing before it, of pressing a hand against its surface, and feeling the coolness of whatever lies on the other side, is itself the purpose. The return is not a failure to arrive. The return is the arrival. The coming back again and again to the same ancient stone with the same unanswerable question is not a sign that the investigation has stalled. It is a sign that the monument is doing what it has always done, drawing attention, holding it, releasing it, and drawing it back in a cycle as regular and as ancient as the sand that buries and reveals, buries and reveals, buries and reveals without end and without haste in the long, slow rhythm of the plateau breathing. The stone does not ask to be understood. It does not lean toward comprehension the way a teacher leans toward a student, offering simplified versions of itself in the hope of being grasped. It simply persists, holding its layered record of carving and weathering and repair with the same indifference with which it held the compressed bodies of Eocene sea creatures for 40 million years before the first chisel touched its surface. Understanding, if it comes, must travel toward the stone rather than away from it. It must cross the distance between a mind that needs answers and a material that offers only conditions, surfaces, textures, sequences, relationships, and it must arrive willing to accept that conditions are not the same as conclusions, that the journey does not end with certainty, but with something quieter, something closer to acquaintance. The way you come to know a landscape, not by mapping it exhaustively, but by walking through it repeatedly until the shape of the ground enters your body and you no longer need to think about where to place your feet. What the Sphinx permits us to say, after all. The evidence has been gathered and weighed and debated across more than a century of formal investigation is substantial but bounded. The monument is carved from a known geological formation. Its enclosure supplied blocks for nearby temples. Its orientation follows the equinoctial axis. Its surfaces record complex weathering shaped by variable stone quality, fluctuating sand cover, episodic moisture, and extensive human intervention. Its written record begins not with a birth certificate, but with a maintenance report filed by a civilization that found it already ancient, already buried, already sacred, already in need of care. These statements rest on measurement and observation. They do not require faith. They do not require speculation. They require only the patience to read what the stone has recorded and the discipline to stop reading where the record stops. Beyond that boundary, the questions remain open, and the openness is not a failure. It is a property of the evidence as intrinsic to the monument as the limestone itself, as permanent as the crack that runs through the enclosure wall, as patient as the dust that settles into it, grain by grain across the millennia. The question of whether the Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt cannot be answered with the data currently available. It can be bounded, it can be constrained, it can be discussed with precision about what each line of evidence supports and where each line of evidence reaches its limit. But it cannot be closed, and the inability to close it is not a deficiency of scholarship. It is an accurate reflection of a record that preserves sequence without preserving origin, that documents duration without documenting inception, that holds the shape of time without holding its name. There is peace in this. Not the peace of resolution, not the peace of a question answered and filed away, but the deeper peace of a question held openly without anxiety, without the need to force it into a shape it does not naturally take. The Sphinx has held this question for as long as it has existed. It has held it through the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom, through the Greek administration and the Roman occupation, through the Arab conquest and the Ottoman centuries, through the age of photography and the age of laser scanning, through every framework that human intelligence has constructed to make sense of the past. None of these frameworks has exhausted the monument. None has captured it fully. Each has illuminated certain facets, while leaving others in shadow, and the shadows are not empty, they are simply unlit, waiting for a light that has not yet been invented, or an angle of approach that has not yet been tried. Let the question rest, not because it has been answered, but because it has been honoured, carried carefully through the evidence, turned slowly in the hands of multiple disciplines examined under different lights, and set down again at the place where knowledge meets its own boundary, and recognises that the boundary is not a wall, but a horizon, a line that recedes as you approach it, that defines the edge of vision, without defining the edge of existence. The Sphinx is older than its documentation. How much older remains a matter of constrained interpretation rather than settled fact. The stone allows this ambiguity. The stone has always allowed it. And the stone will continue to hold the question long after the current generation of investigators has joined the long succession of hands that touched the surface, felt the coolness rising from within, and stepped back without having fully understood what lay beneath. Not defeated, not frustrated, but quieted the way. The desert quiets everything, eventually folding sound into sand, folding motion, into stillness, folding the urgent human need to know into the ancient geological patience of a ridge that was a seabed once and a monument once and will be dust eventually, but not yet. Not tonight. Not while the stars still turn above the plateau and the stone still holds its shape against the dark. We've reached the edge of tonight's journey, traveller. The plateau is quiet now. The stars have shifted since we began, though you may not have noticed time moves differently when you are listening to stone. We have travelled far together through dust and silence, and the deep-layered memory of a ridge that was a seabed once through evidence and anomaly, and the long, slow breath of a planet that does not measure its exhalations in human years. None of what you heard tonight needs to be remembered. It has already settled into you the way sediment settles into limestone grain by grain, without effort, without conscious arrangement finding its place in the dark. In the end, traveller, it is all right to not understand. The Sphinx does not understand itself, the stone does not know its own age, and yet it endures, and that endurance is enough to hold the question, enough to hold the silence, enough to hold you as you drift now toward the gentlest form of burial, the one that comes each night and covers everything softly and completely and without permanence. Let gravity hold you. Let the questions fade. Let the weight of your body become the weight of stone cooling slowly after a long day beneath the sun. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. Tonight the universe whispers again. Sleep, traveller. The cosmos will keep watch.